Grain Elevator and Processing Society is hosting their annual GEAPS Exchange Conference at the Kansas City Convention Center, February 22nd through the 25th of 2025. GEAPS Exchange is the biggest and best show in the grain industry with more than 400 exhibitors and 45 hours of education. It is the best place to find grain handling and processing operation solutions all in one place. GEAPS Exchange brings together industry professionals from across the world to help build professional networks and connect with the products you need. Come walk the trade show floor, take part in live demonstrations, innovation stations, and see new equipment. Make valuable connections through a variety of fun and exciting social events. Early bird pricing ends January 28th. Learn more and register at jeeps.com/exchange. Coming up is a conversation I had with a highly regarded leader within the grain handling and processing industry. He's the author of more than 250 technical and general articles on grain quality, measurement science, and grain marketing. We discuss a number of topics. How one defines grain quality can vary depending on where you are in the market chain. Our guest goes deep on grain quality. Our guest also generates an annual crop quality and crop storage report. Find out what goes into developing such a report and how does the report support the industry. Where will the market likely go? And what highly interesting thing does our guest say is causing a culture change within the grain handling and processing industry? And for those who are curious about the Food Safety Modernization Act and its impact on grain elevators and grain facilities, our expert will provide key insights. And if that's not enough, we're talking traceability and how we think about the future. Let's go. Hey folks, welcome to Whole Grain. My name is Jim Lenz, your host and Director of Training and Education at GEAPS, where the mission of the Grain Elevator and Processing Society is about people and information and knowledge, and the mission of the industry is about feeding the world. Thanks for listening today and for joining the network of thousands of other grain handling and processing professionals across the globe taking strategic steps to grow professionally. The Whole Grain Show will give you the competitive advantage to win at work so you can make more of an impact. In today's show, we welcome Dr. Charles Hurburgh, Charlie to most everyone. Charlie manages the Iowa State Grain Quality Research Laboratory and the extension-based Iowa Grain Quality Initiative that's focused on grain handling, grain processing, and grain distribution. Charlie is a native Iowan and continues to operate the family farm. He has a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and doctoral degree from Iowa State and specializes in quality management systems with related traceability, measurements, and sensor technologies. He has been a GEAPS member since 1983 and was elected in 2022 as a GEAPS International Board Director. He serves on several key advisory and editorial committees related to quality management standards and food safety regulations. Most recently, his extension group was asked by the FDA to create training materials for inspections of bulk grain and grain processing facilities under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Today, we welcome Charlie Hurburgh, Professor of Agriculture and Biosystems Engineering at Iowa State University. It's an honor to connect with you, Charlie. Thanks for being part of Whole Grain, the new podcast presented by GEAPS.
I'm very happy to be part of the initial round of these podcasts for GEAPS. It represents a very important expansion of GEAPS training and education functions. I know that being also on the board of GEAPS, they're very excited about the outreach that this brings, and so I'm happy to contribute.
Well, it means a lot that you're here. I know it's been very busy and productive last couple of days for you for all things under the umbrella of the grain industry. I'm looking forward to discussing what you've been doing and what you've been working on lately and how it impacts those in the grain industry. But first, to help capture some of the hearts and minds of our Whole Grain listeners who may or may not be GEAPS members, would you be willing to add a bit of lightheartedness and personal perspective by sharing a professional mantra or success quote that you live by?
Yeah, I'm a NASCAR fan. And so my quote is, or my watchword that I tell my students all the time, you got to run wide open.
I love that. Can you just provide a little more detail behind that?
Yeah, many NASCAR races are run with the cars very equal in speed. And for those of you that are NASCAR fans, you're going to know what I'm about to say, particularly the ones with limited horsepower or restrictor plates at Daytona and Talladega. And in order to win those races, you can't lift. You cannot lift in the corner. You can't lift on the straightaways. No matter where it takes you, high or low on the track, you've got to hold it wide open.
That's great. Good to know a little background about you, too. Good to have lots of neat experiences and interests. Now, can you share some of the things you've been researching, collecting, sharing over the last few days?
Yes, sure I can. This is an active time for me in grain handling extension. This is an active time because basically it's when the new crop first appears. And any processor will tell you that that is the witching hour in a year, the changeover from old crop to new, or in the case of grain handling, what's the new crop going to bring us? So for the last probably 2 weeks, I've been talking to people all over the grain industry about what they're seeing, our extension people, what they're seeing in the field for crop development. That all makes a difference. Crop quality, it's always true. Crop quality is determined at the end of the growing season, primarily, at least in our area, after Labor Day. Earlier than that in the South, where the season is a little longer and so forth. But it isn't until then that the degree of grain fill is known, whether we're going to have mold or not mold problems or not, toxin problems or not, excessive moisture or not. All of that is basically an open game until you get to the end of the growing season. That's not true for yield. Yield is determined right along when the corn plant, for example, decides how long is the ear going to be, how many rows of kernels, how many kernels deep is it going to be. The yield is set right through the growing season, but the quality just isn't until you get right to the end. Quality is a really broad brush term.
Right.
There are a lot of things that go into it. It could be the moisture. For example, we aren't going to, but we could have had a year like 2009 where it just rained and rained and rained and rained, and we had low test weight and high moisture clear up to Thanksgiving. Or there have been years where it's been 100 degrees right after Labor Day, and all talk of drying revenue and wet corn and so forth went out the window. We ended up with very dry corn right out of the field. That's just one example of how the end of the season activity or the end of the season weather and other conditions set the stage for what we're going to have quality-wise. And sometimes, and as you know, I'm kind of prone to making forecasts, and I've made some forecasts that have been 100% wrong because the weather didn't turn out the way we thought it would. And I don't remember a number of years ago, but we had a late planted crop, and it was looking like this was going to be one that grain dryers would get a workout. Well, it turned off over 100 degrees after Labor Day for about a week, and the crop died and dried in a week. Wow. Totally different than was predicted. So that's what I mean by it's the end of the season that defines what the grain quality is, regardless of what you think of as grain quality. Everybody has a different definition depending on where in the market chain you are.
Very interesting. You have received a lot of communications.
Yeah.
Some of them quite urgent, some of maybe not. So what kind of things are people inquiring with you about?
Well, we had a drought year, actually. And if you look at the United States Drought Monitor website that is updated every week, you can see that a good share of Iowa was under significant moisture stress. And that always gets people nervous about whether we're going to have particularly aflatoxin. Basically, a dry year here mimics some of the conditions that happen every year in some of the southern states. And that's where more of the concern over aflatoxin is. And we don't generally have it, but in dry, hot years, we can. And a lot of the questions that I got were about whether or not I thought we were going to have potential for in the field mold and then subsequently aflatoxin. Of course, you couldn't answer that really directly until we started into this period of very beautiful weather, which took the risk away. It just completely cleaned that risk out of consideration. But those are the kinds of questions. Also, what do you think about grain drying revenue? Very practical question that grain handlers ask. What do you think about grain drying revenue, and how much propane gas am I going to need? And again, that's another you have to kind of get to fairly close to the end of the show before you can figure out whether or not that's going to be high or low or about average. But those are the types of questions.
We'll be back after a quick break.
GEAPS Training and Education Program is proud to release Introduction to Grain Operations. This new course is a multimedia version of what was known as GEAPS 500, with dynamic graphics, video examples, photographs, multidimensional illustrations, animations, and interactive exercises. This course is sure to prepare your team for the work you need them to do. This is a great industry primer at a great price. For a limited time, GEAPS members may purchase the course for just $195. Non-members still save and pay just $295. For more information, visit jeeps.com. If you could tell us a little bit about what you do, about your team, your organization.
I run what is technically known at Iowa State University as the Iowa Grain Quality Initiative. That's basically just a moniker for the extension program focused at grain handling, grain processing, grain distribution, things not in the field, after harvest things. And our program is pointed at those kind of things. It's a research and an extension program. That's typical at land-grant universities because, quite frankly, we need the research dollars and grants in order to support the programming that we have in other areas. So and same for the teaching, same for the classroom teaching. But my program is research and extension, which means my primary activities are with extension is off campus. That's how I guess that's how the land grant system got the name, but it's for the industry or the trade or whatever you're serving. Agronomy has an extension program, agricultural engineering has one, so on down the line. And mine is in the grain processing and grain handling. So that's my primary work. And then the research material basically grows out of what we do. In simple terms, someone asks a question, an extension specialist says, I don't know, there's a research project. In very simple terms, that's how it works. And for the most part, it works pretty well.
Well stated. So such a critical, important piece. As you just mentioned, you've been working on the Crop Quality and Crop Storage 2022 report. Before you share some of the forecast results of the report, I would imagine that a lot of individuals and organizations are simply curious on how it is assembled. I mean, how do you gather your evidence to support the report? Who's all involved in the process? And finally, what value can one draw from such a report, even from different region outside of the state of Iowa? You know, because they are also working on their own sort of reports to serve their needs and interests of the grain handling processing industry, you know, in their region.
Well, to answer the last part of your question first, grain plants are relatively predictable. And so generally what affects one area, if it's the same conditions, it's generally going to affect another one. So it's logical enough to be able to, at least within areas that have had reasonably the same weather conditions during the year and had reasonably the same planting conditions early on, that many of the things you determine in one place will apply to the other. Now, for sure, somebody in the Mississippi Delta growing soybeans, well, that's different than Iowa. We know that. I mean, that's quite a bit different than Iowa. So there will be some places that just have a totally different set of growing situations. Another example would be North and South Dakota, being so far north and having so much shorter growing season than ours. And now back to your question about how does this sort of thing get put together? I will confess that I often call it a crop quality and storage report. It's really a forecast. It's really an assessment. And this is a characteristic of extension. We take the data, the raw data that is given us by the USDA, could be by private companies, could be in any number of ways. And frankly, there's a lot of then judgment, probably more so than a government crop report. A government crop report is numbers. What is going on? What is happening? Extension reports are, what is your assessment of how all these factors fit together into something? And that's what the crop report is, more so than simply a tabulation of data and so forth. In the extension system, these things admittedly become a little individualized. I said I had staff and so on, and they have their own areas of expertise. For example, one of my staff works pretty much exclusively with mycotoxins and follows weather conditions and so forth, and is working on some research projects in modeling, estimating, numeric modeling of mycotoxin development. But when it comes right down to it, and frankly, today, the presentation to our local GEAPS chapter, I have come to just rely on as the starting of the crop season. I do it every year, and it's the starting of the crop season. And it is a lot judgment as well as the weather maps and so forth. It's a lot judgment. So it tends to be somewhat individually driven, and that's typical of extension. The agronomists do the same thing in their respective areas, soil scientists, etc., do the same thing. In essence, with extension, Iowa is paying for, or the state is paying for, a group of highly experienced consultants. That's what extension does, and provides then best estimates. You probably have heard of Chad Hart, who was our forecast market economist. And Chad uses the same data everybody else does with the government report and planning progress reports and so forth, but then makes an assessment of where the market is likely to go and what are some of the future driving factors that are likely to be important. That's what our so-called crop report is. And I will have to take either credit or Rotten Tomatoes, either one, for whichever way it goes, and how well we can give agribusiness and farmers a view of what good management might be in the coming months. That's what it is.
It doesn't just happen. It comes with experience. So that's great that you have just shared that. But again, quality is still taking shape yet of that. So, but yes. Could you share a little bit about Iowa? Because we have listeners from around the world who don't know where Iowa is. What crops you're growing there. How big is it in just your general geographic area? And I know you mentioned in the earlier conversation that looks quite promising this year.
Iowa is the largest grain producing state in the United States. We're number one in corn, and we've bounced number one and number two in soybeans. But if you add them together, the total volume, Iowa, of course, grains, Iowa is by far the number one. And in fact, if you called Iowa a country, if you called Iowa a country by itself, aside from the United States, we'd rank third behind Brazil and Argentina. And so it is true, the major driver of the total crop production in the United States, Iowa's probably the major driver. And when you take Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, 3 states right across the middle, often with roughly similar weather conditions and roughly similar soil types and so forth, that really makes the U.S. production. It's not all of it, of course, but how the weather goes and how the planting season and harvest season goes in those, at least in those 3 states, it sets the tone for the entire country.
Major impact.
Yes. If you think about last year, we had some near record crops, and Iowa was the leader in that. We had a rather fantastic year last year. This year, maybe a little bit less, but still, we're going to be the leading corn producing state in the country. We still are. And if I had to guess, I'd say that when all things are said and done, Iowa may be a little bit better than some of the numeric forecasters say we are going to be. But we'll see. That'll all come out when the combine has a vote. For the next 3 months, September, October, November, the heart of the harvest season, the weather forecast is about as favorable as you could write it. I don't know that you could write it much more favorably. Warm but not hot temperatures. And of course, there will be exceptions and periods of rain and periods of cold and so forth. But warm but not hot temperatures. Low moisture but not dry. In other words, some rain but not totally dry. And moderate low temperatures. In other words, low temperatures in the 50s, 60s, 40s sometimes. That is absolutely ideal for maturing crops, bringing crops along in a steady but rapid pace and removing the threat of in-the-field mold, high moisture, other crop problems. I don't see a lot of those if the 3-month advanced forecast holds.
I would like to spend a little time on aspects of the FSMA and the role that it may or may not play when it comes to grain elevators to share with our listeners. FSMA stands for the Food Safety Modernization Act.
Yes.
It's an act in the United States that has transformed the nation's food safety system by shifting the focus from responding to foodborne illnesses to preventing foodborne illnesses. At least certainly there is that effort and change. So there has been a big shift going on. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has finalized 7 major rules to implement FSMA, recognizing the safety of the food supply is shared responsibly among many different points of the global food chain supply for both human and animal food. Could you share with our listeners if the Food Safety Modernization Act impacts grain elevators? If so, in what depth and scope does FSMA have on grain elevators and grain facilities?
FSMA was a big overhaul of our food regulatory system. The key point is that this rule, and I'll get to your question in just a second, but the FSMA rule, unlike almost any other governmental rule, is what I would call audit and discussion based rather than checklist based. FSMA does not tell you how to do anything. That is, how to sweep your pit and keep it clean, how to manage grain and storage. It doesn't tell you how. It just says you should, you will, and you will be evaluated by FDA against I think there's 8 good manufacturing practices that are required under FSMA. You will be evaluated under those, which are general statements, like I just said, as to your ability to keep the grain in and keep food safety hazards out by your regular manufacturing processes. It also asks that food processors, and in this case, by food, I mean animal or human. Mm-hmm. FDA makes little difference, really, but in their thought process between human food and animal food. So the human food rules and the animal food rules, with some differences, are reasonably close. They're certainly close in philosophy. Users are supposed to evaluate what their potential risks might be. There's a lot of them. When you start going down and brainstorming on where the potential risks are, you come with quite a list. And then evaluate those risks yourself and come to conclusions as to whether or not your practices cover them or don't. And if they don't, what are you going to do about it? And this is all then self-done. The FDA inspector becomes an auditor. It becomes an evaluator of how well did you do And how well did you convince me, the auditor, that you had all the documentation and you had this all under control? So that's different than checking to see if every pulley has a machine guard, for example, in work in OSHA. Open wheel is guarded and things like that, which are checklist items. You do it kind of things. Now, back to the elevator. The elevator, it handles, RAC is the key word here, raw agricultural commodities. It passes raw agricultural commodities through. And so it is not responsible to go through the risk analysis that a food processor would have to do. It is responsible for general good manufacturing practices should the FDA choose to check. Facilities that are subject to FSMA, that make a food product or transform a food product, facilities that are subject to FSMA, in theory, will be audited on a periodic basis. Now, that's subject to resource limitations and the capability of the agency and so forth, but subject to a regular audit program. Basically, the check on the grain elevator is the next step in the line, who typically is a processor and therefore has to be responsible for all of these hazards they may encounter. And remember, most hazards in grain come from the field. They come from the farm because they're mold or they're insect or something that came in with the grain. So there's already a internal brake on the grain elevator. And if the elevator is actually the procurement, the grain receiving, like a mill elevator for a processor, then they're covered completely. They are part of the evaluation because they're part of the processing facility. An elevator by itself that just buys and sells grain is not directly, but indirectly it certainly is, because the next step in the line is part of FSMA. We know that it's automatically so. The next step in the line is part of FSMA. So that may sound like a partial answer, but the way the rule is written right now, handlers of raw commodities that just buy them and don't make any transformations, just store them and pass them on, are not subject to the risk analysis part of FSMA.
That actually, Charlie, is very good clarity. Thank you for that. Appreciate your response.
The people, the staff in the elevators that are connected to food processing plants, this can be a very interesting experience to have to take the elevator into the food safety world, which means housekeeping, moldy grain, no, none, laying it around in the driveways, or heaven forbid, the boot pit. You go into a boot pit and you'll find most anything. So at least it has started to cause a culture change through the grain handling industry. There's no doubt in my mind. Whether the facility is directly covered or is not, is indirectly covered by being part of the subsequent marketing chain, a culture change is happening.
Yeah, so they got to be conscious of it. It also depends on if there's a transformation of the grain into a food product. But it's an audit, self-managed.
Mycotoxins are the tough point of grain because they are a risk. They are a hazard. The elevator typically does not create them. They came from whatever the growing conditions were in the field. They're hard to measure. Some would say impossible, but certainly hard to measure, expensive to measure, slow. Mycotoxins are the biggest challenge.
Another thing that I think could be a concern, I'm wondering, is related to traceability. Now, in one of my previous roles outside of GEAPS, I served as vice president for an identity firm, essentially a startup. Our focus was largely in the areas of agriculture, climate, environment, government, and supply chain. Now, in agriculture, our field traceability technology helped modernize supply chains in developing and undeveloped regions. We leverage DLT, or distributed ledger technology, and other emerging technologies to create trusted data systems to best support assets. And it allows for improved visibility, efficiency, speed, and again, trust. It's changing companies and really changing the world. As an example, the platform supported Mongolia's second largest export in terms of trading volume. What was it? Cashmere.
Yeah.
So these are very priced cashmere fibers that come from Mongolian goats, and cashmere comprises 83% of agriculture output in Mongolia. Our organization partnered with cashmere farmers and the UN to utilize Ethereum-based blockchain technology to interact with over 70 different herders and 8 cooperatives. Herders used a simple Android app to register their cashmere along with RFID tags, which then gets pinned on a map instantly. This gives the consumer of cashmere confidence. Whoever the consumer is, wherever they are in the world, it gives them confidence in the supply chain and that the cashmere came from these farmers in Mongolia. So it is being tracked, the supply chain. Where is the original source coming from? And so we are seeing a growing interest from governments all over the world in traceability. Identity firms continue to emerge. Startups are continuing to pop up to take advantage of what's going on. They see the future. Contracts between governments and identity firms continue to evolve to support trusted traceability programs like our organization had with not just Mongolia, Australia, for example. And now to bring this back to the grain handling and processing industry. Here in the U.S., the FDA and the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, demonstrate a desire to track both animal and, as you said, human consumption within the supply chain. And as they focus more on preventing foodborne illnesses and less time on responding to foodborne illnesses, because there is this transformation, we are seeing a move towards traceability in the grain sectors, right? It's hitting all different types of markets, some more than others, but it is hitting the grain sector. There's a lot of discussion going on about this, certainly emerging topic. There are a lot of things for grain elevators and cooperatives to juggle right now, without thinking about traceability, with the challenges of attracting and retaining employees, huge right now, converting to possible automation systems, examining their current infrastructure. Can they support that now? Those are huge investments, to best support the volume and quality of grain. And now we have traceability, right? So Charlie, what should grain operators be aware of right now when it comes to traceability and the FSMA? What should they need to possibly prepare for in the future?
Well, first, let me point out that bulk grain, bulk commodity, doesn't necessarily have to be grain, but bulk commodities, there's one big difference that affects the traceability situation between, say, that and the bag of cashmere that could have come off a specific goat, one individual goat. But it is, at its start, put into an identified lot. That bag can go wherever it goes, and it has the RFID tag that can be read anywhere, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in Mongolia or wherever it is. Grain's not that way because it does not start out as a definable lot. I and some of my students are trying to figure out how we could create a definable lot that might be statistically kept together or some kind of statistical estimate of where it went. But in truth, grain gets dumped in a combine, dumped in a grain cart, taken into a truck, combined with other loads. Then we take some out of the storage bin to sell it to somebody, and there's some left. Okay, where'd the original combine lot go? And that's where the difficulty in traceability in bulk commodities is. They can be combined, and they can be split pretty much as the market needs because they're not defined specially as that grain. Now, there is an exception in grain. Obviously, organic grain is handled by itself. But even then, organic grain from several farmers may get combined. It's still organic grain, but it may get combined into one lot. And there's where the difficulty in true traceability is. Determining where the lots go through the processing chain. I won't go into a lot of detail. We're giving this some thought as to how we might, with computer modeling and so forth, and the vast computing capabilities of the cloud, how we might do that. Blockchain has been pointed to a lot. Blockchain is a giant database. And so it relies on accurate data being put in order to have accurate tracing of the material. But now here comes the problem again of the bulk commodity that gets subdivided, recombined, subdivided again, and all of that without a box around it, without any specific identity. That's where the traceability gets complicated. We have tried to do some traceability examples in commodity elevators, in grain elevators, and we learned basically that one, you won't be perfect. There's no such thing as perfection in there. Mm-hmm. And two, that there are things that you asked me about what grain elevators could do. There are things that grain elevators can do to make their odds better and their window smaller as to where any particular problem grain might have ended up. And it starts right at the beginning. Grain comes into an elevator. Okay, where'd you put it? I would judge many elevators could not go to their records and say, well, this went to Annex 101. It's the 15th load that went in there. That's a data collection issue to do that. Yeah. That alone gives you tremendously better knowledge of where that grain could subsequently have gone based on the subsequent handling and so forth. And that's just one small example. Right. So it's operating practices and recording practices that will improve the traceability. I'm not sure we'll ever get to one-to-one. That is, every farmer's load shows up in some definable place. I don't think we're going to do that.
Yeah, it just seems so challenging to track that. Just not all commodities are the same.
They don't flow the same way.
Yeah.
There's a number of things. One of our students is working on a modeling process that has shown some promise in terms of being able to narrow the window down to maybe plus or minus 10% or something like that. And that's better than we have done. It may be good enough depending on why you're doing the traceability. What is the objective?
Yeah, that's a good thing. And maybe that's kind of where that lies, is in the niche specialty grains, how the supply chain is configured.
Yeah. And on the other hand, now animal feed is subject to FSMA. And if you have something that is out of tolerance or contains a hazard that you were controlling for, that basically implies a recall procedure. And now we could get back into that same question, but with bulk commodities, not just a specialty that has a unique property that somebody else is willing to pay extra for.
Right.
We may not be in at all times. Where did the grain that got the carbon credits go? Who bought the ethanol that was made from the corn that got the carbon credits from raising the cover crops? Good question.
Yeah, this is great discussion.
Changing. The world is changing.
Yes, certainly something to have discussion about, along with so many other things that are on the horizon and challenging for operators. All right. Now, Charlie, you've been so active with GEAPS and with GEAPS members. We thank you for your continued support over the years. From your perspective, Charlie, what are the benefits of being a GEAPS member?
I think I could say this without exaggerating. GEAPS made it possible for me to do what I do at the university. I'll explain. The grain handling industry was not just populated with academics and researchers and professors. There are not very many in that industry. And when I started out, there were a couple of GEAPS members that made it possible for me to first present at a GEAPS convention and then be on what we used to have, the Grades and Weights Committee. And I think there was one other too. I can't remember all of it. But in any event, GEAPS made it possible for me to be respected in the practice of grain handling and processing, and that's necessary because I couldn't do what I do now without that respect.
That is pretty powerful and special. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, I didn't know you were going to ask it, but I never take an opportunity to thank GEAPS for doing that, for that being the meaning for me.
Oh, that is wonderful. That means a lot. And so many people share that same sentiment of you.
Well,
it's so nice to hear. Now, before we conclude, I'd like to start a sentence, and I'd love for you to conclude the sentence. Being part of the GEAPS family means,
from a business perspective at least, if I get in a jam for something I don't know about grain handling or grain processing, I know there's somebody that knows more than I do, and I can call them up and ask the question. That, on the professional side, that would be how I would finish the sentence with the meaning of GEAPS. On the more personal side, I always know that a beer isn't far away when I go. And
I
people
love that.
Enjoy it with.
Absolutely. Oh, that's so great to hear, Charlie. That is so nice. And when you listen to a couple podcast episodes prior to yours,
yes,
you're going to smile because some individuals said almost exactly the same thing as you. There is commonality. It's a family, trusted partners. If someone has a question, a challenge, and it sometimes is very urgent, within 20 minutes, they're confident that they can get the help that they need because of the network and GEAPS family that they've created.
They can get it even if the issue is a bit controversial, maybe a little bit, maybe there could be 2 or 3 different sides to things. It seems like when we get together in venues sponsored by GEAPS, people take their hats off and you get some direct answers, and maybe you find out you all were wrong, but that's okay. But the point is that it is not so polarized. It is much more open. I find that that's one of the key networking benefits. Being an academic, for the longest time, it took a while. Academics were thought of as not part of the real world. After all, you haven't dumped a load of grain in your life, have you? Well, yes, I have, because we have a farm. But the point is, I wasn't in the industry, and it took a while to build that connectivity. And without GEAPS, I guarantee you couldn't have. I couldn't have.
Charlie, I tell you what, it's been an incredible honor. We've connected in email. We finally connected sort of in person, virtually here. And you've touched so many. It's great to see that GEAPS has touched you and your family.
Oh, yeah.
It really means a lot. What a special interview. This is something I'll remember for a long time. So on behalf of GEAPS, the entire GEAPS team, Charlie, we thank you. We thank you for your service. We thank you for your networking opportunities, experience, and like you said, spending time having great conversation.
Yeah, and my family has been right in there. That's another thing that GEAPS does, is it encourages family participation to make relationships that last a lifetime.
That is so good to hear. So good to hear. I've been here since the end of May 2022, and I just am so impressed by how you speak and how others speak about GEAPS and how they speak about each other. So if anybody's listening right now who has thought, maybe I should look and investigate into GEAPS a little bit.
Being a membership organization as opposed to a corporate membership organization, an individual membership, has real meaning in this way.
That's powerful. We're going to end right there. Charlie, have yourself a wonderful day. Thank you for the great dialogue. I know our listeners are going to love this episode. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it too.
Grain quality, crop reports, the role of extension offices, FSMA, traceability, and the power of the grain handling and grain processing family. Thank you, Charlie, for enlightening our minds using this whole grain show to stimulate further conversations within our facilities, chapter meetings, and more. There certainly were a lot of fun topics to discuss. I like the way the conversation concluded with a showcase of how we as a group of grain handling and processing professionals support each other. If you are not currently a member and are considering GEAPS membership, I strongly recommend visiting jeeps.com/membership. We offer individual membership and facility and company membership. And for a broad look on all that we have to offer to best serve you, visit jeeps.com. That's GEAPS.com. Have yourself a great day, and thanks for listening to Whole Grain.